Howdy guys, welcome back to Land Talk Podcast, where we talk about all things to do with land. Today we're going to be covering, kind of one of the more intricate details of land ownership, which is easements. So easements come into play a lot on properties. So we kind of want to talk today about how those could affect your property. And with me I've got Justin. He's one of my land agents here at Texas Rec Land. And Justin, kind of give us your background. Kind of where do you come from? What's your expertise there?
Sure. Well, good morning, John. My name is Justin Baronato, and I'm a land agent with Texas Rec Land Real Estate. I started out my career as a surveyor in the field almost 20 years ago. Wow. And I spent about 10 years in the field, and then I transitioned into the office. And now I'm in charge of all of our field operations, as well as quotes and bidding for my survey company, and I do a lot of the deed research and drafting as well.
Right, so I'm sure you run into easements a lot when you're looking at stuff. So
it's kind of a daily thing.
So when we're talking about easements, I guess let's simplify easements for everybody. So kind of when you hear the word easements, what's the most simplest form of what an easement is?
It's a good question. I guess it is the right for somebody else to use a property that they don't own. So the right for a utility company to use a portion of a property, or another person to use a portion of a property that they don't own to access another property or access something on the property.
Yeah, and then I think a lot of times, like in bigger cities, you get into public easements, right, which would be sidewalks and stuff like that, which we don't run into that much on land, luckily. But yeah, so in someone else having the right to use your property, kind of what are some of the pitfalls with having an easement on your property? I mean, what are some of the dangers of it?
I see more lawsuits having to do with easements than just about anything else land related, including boundaries. And easements, especially for access, can be contested by the landowner that the easement is crossing. And landowners also can contest utility easements. They don't want people crossing their land without their consent.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times, as with life in general, the more people you involve, the more opportunity for problems and disagreements, right? So when we're looking at easements, I mean, the ones we seem to run in the most, in my mind, are usually power easements, water line easements, access easements. I know sometimes you see pipeline easements. Those are more rare, but you run into those. So these are things that kind of sit on your property that arguably it's kind of a way for anybody to come back later and have the right to use your property, arguably kind of against your will because somebody gave them the right to do it. So
now power line easements and water line easements a lot of times aren't as contested if the owner of that property is utilizing the power or the water. Right.
So easements aren't necessarily a bad thing.
They're not necessarily a bad thing, but if it's just for a transmission line that crosses your property and you're not seeing any money from that
or use of it,
then it can turn into an issue.
Yeah. So looking at easements, I mean, we run into easements. Most of them are written, right, which is the way they arguably should be. But tell us about some unwritten easements, some verbal easements. I mean, we kind of run into some issues like that sometimes too, right?
Sure. So most easements are deeded easements or written easements that are recorded. There are easements that are called prescriptive easements. So it's an easement that is just there from use, and mostly those are access prescriptive easements. And let's say a landowner owned 50 acres and he sold the back 25 acres. Well, you can't landlock that piece of property, and there may not be a deeded easement, but it was implied and people have been using a set roadway or path to get back to that property. And let's just say that front piece was sold once, twice, 3 times. There may not be an easement that's picked up by a title company during that sale, but then again, that easement is there because it's been used for all those years.
Right. So I guess when we're looking at buying a property, let's say we've never owned a property, this is a new property. How do people typically go about finding out what easements are on a property?
That's a great question. So the number one thing you need to do is open up a title with a title company. and title company is going to research that property and find any easements or setbacks that might affect that property, and that's going to be listed in the Schedule B of the title commitment. And then the second best thing you can do, actually, I would argue the first best thing you can do is to get a land title survey. And the surveyor is going to survey your property, all the improvements, the boundaries, and then go through that Schedule B portion of the title commitment and illustrate or list any of those easements that affect the property. Why it's important to get a survey is Schedule B can pick up easements, anything around the property within a 5-mile radius, right? So how do you know if the pipeline easement that's listed in Schedule B actually affects your property? You're going to have to hire a surveyor to do a little work and figure it out.
Right. So I know we've had some properties here that, let's say they were subdivided, and once upon a time they were 1,000 acres maybe. I know we've seen it to where the title commitment comes back and Schedule B has 100 things in it.
Yeah.
Just because there's multiple, lots of water line easements, power easements, and that easement may be 3 miles away.
Right.
And
Not all of those easements affect the property that's being sold, but it may have affected the 1,000 acres sometime in the past.
Right. So it's kind of, I feel like getting the work done the proper way, it's a nice way to kind of weed out the stuff that doesn't apply and leave you with kind of, hey, this is the end all be all. These are actually the people who may have a right to come use your property. And I think it's super important to obviously, look in that Schedule B and know what could affect your property. And then every one of those easements that are recorded, there's going to be a copy of that easement. It's going to tell you who has the power to use that easement, how long the easement lasts. Generally, and this is probably generally, but most easements are perpetual. A lot of them don't end, right? So you need to know how long they can last. There are some with time limits, but most of them are not. And I think it's going to tell you how wide that easement is. Is it narrow? Is it wide? Is it a blanket easement, right? We can get into blanket easements in a minute. But I think it's just important to know that, hey, this is a possibility, and I need to be aware of where that is and how it could affect me. In the sense that, let's say you have a property and there's an easement for a transmission line. Let's argue it's not there. Let's say they never built it. However, you could buy that property and some years later they could come in and build this transmission line. Well, you need to know, hey, I cannot build a house there. I can't build any permanent improvement. Let's say I improve the property. I plant a bunch of really good grass or trees or whatever it may be. They have the right to come in and bulldoze everything that I've ever done and kind of take that away. So, but give us kind of the rundown of a defined easement over a blanket easement. That's kind of the two you see most of the time, right?
Sure. So a defined easement is generally going to have an exhibit map and a meets and bounds description that defines that easement. So a pipeline easement may have a description from one property line to another with, of course, a series of bearings and distances that define that easement. There could also be an easement that is centered on an existing pipeline, so you have to have that pipeline located by the utility company to know where that easement is.
But basically, a defined one is kind of pinning it to one location, right?
They can never move it to one location.
So.
A blanket easement, many times electric easements are blanket easements because the electric company is going to run those poles kind of wherever they see fit to get up to a house, and you're generally not going to argue that because you want power.
But most of the time, blanket easements really turn into defined easements in a way because that blanket shrinks down to the physical either pole or pipe. So I know those, but there could be some blanket easements that never get you never build the pipeline or the power line, and then you still have that blanket easement over your whole property, and they can build it anywhere they want to.
Sure. So right? Easements encumber properties, and you just have to decide how much that easement is encumbering the property, and if it's going to encumber the property so much that you don't want to buy it, because it can severely limit where you can build, what you can build, and how closely to that easement.
Yeah, and I think it becomes all the more necessary to research this the smaller of a property you get, right? So I think if you have a 5-acre property, and let's say an easement's taking up 2 acres, that's a monumental amount of land. Whereas if you have 100 acres and it's a 2-acre easement, maybe it's no big deal. But
there's two different kinds of easements. There's platted easements and easements by separate instrument. So you can get easements by separate instrument released, assuming the owner of that easement or the person that originally got that easement will release that easement. the only way that I know of to change or remove a platted easement is to replat. And when you get into that, that's a lot of time, a lot of money.
And it affects a lot of people.
And it affects a lot of people. So you want to know if your easement is platted or if it's by separate instrument. That's a huge huge thing.
And I think probably you need to pay attention to all the easements on your property. I think all of them are very important. But I think that a lot of people miss the ones on access, and not necessarily from the one that you're using to get to your property, but maybe an old access easement that goes through the property to get to a neighbor's. Yeah. We see a lot of really old ones. I mean, these things are 50 or 100 years old, and probably for the most part they don't get used anymore. But they're still there, and they may still be binding, and somebody may decide to come back and use that later, and they have every right to do it. So that's kind of it can be a dangerous game.
Easements, like restrictions, run with the property.
Exactly.
So
there's no way to get rid of them unless somebody that had the power to have that easement gives it up. And like in the instance of this old road easement or whatever from a neighbor, I mean, my gosh, that person could not be here anymore. I mean, it could be very complicated, right? It may not be the AT&T or somebody that you can go reach out to, but
sure.
And I think this all kind of lends back to the reason you should get a title policy. And luckily, we don't have to fight a lot of folks on title insurance, but in my mind, this is like the shining example of why you should number one, get a title policy. Number two, get the insurance that provides. So what do you think on that as far as what the insurance can do for you there?
Well, title policies are very important. However, title companies are, for the most part, run by lawyers, sure. And so they accept to a lot of things in that coverage, and that's what that Schedule B is. So if an item is listed in Schedule B, it's essentially telling you if anything in the future comes up having to do with this item, it is not covered under our title policy.
Right.
And I've seen over the years, and close to 20 years of doing this, I've only seen one instance where a title company had to make good on their title policy and actually send a lawyer out and go to bat for the buyer, and that property was conveyed again less than a year later, and that same title company they accepted to that one issue that they went to bat that they missed before. So it's pretty important to look at that. One of my mentors, who's a surveyor for 50 years, told me a story about a land deal in Dallas, and the title policy was going to be well over $100,000 for this title policy. He hired a surveyor to go through and research all the Schedule B documents, produce a land title survey. He got a copy of the survey, and then he went to the title company and said, "I no longer need your title policy," because the survey had everything that he needed to know about.
And he was able to save $100,000.
And he was able to save $100,000.
Yeah, but I think that title work is super important.
Yeah, I wouldn't suggest doing that. I think having title insurance is an important thing. I personally wouldn't buy property without a title policy, but it just goes to show you that if you're savvy, you can definitely do some different things.
And I think, as with everything, knowledge is power. I think the more you know, the more informed you can be, and you make better decisions. But looking at the title policy, which I know at some point we're going to do an episode covering title policies, but the main thing is Schedule B, like you mentioned, is telling you these things apply to this property, therefore we're not going to cover them. But anything not mentioned in there arguably should be covered by the policy. So I had a property, actually it was one that somebody I know bought, and when they bought this property probably 10 or 12 years ago, they bought this particular property, and one of their requirements was they did not want it to have a water line easement. I'm not sure why. They did not want an easement on the road. And that was one of the particular reasons they bought the property they did, because it didn't have that easement. And lo and behold, the landowner shows up one day, and the water company's on his property, trenching a line to go along the road to get a new water line in. And of course, the landowner's really upset, as he should be, because he's thinking, man, I bought this property because I didn't want a water line easement, and here's the water company. So obviously his first stop was to go back to the title company and say, hey, you told me there was no water line easement here. We have Schedule B. We looked at it. It's not mentioned. So if y'all are wrong, then obviously you're gonna have to make good on this and either fix the issue or pay up on the policy. And as it turns out, the title company was right. There was no easement there, and the water company was wrong. But it's just kind of one of those things of he thought he knew what was going on, and it turns out he did. It turns out the title company was right. he made the right choice, but actually it was nice to be able to lean on that title policy when you go back to the water company and say, what are y'all doing here? You're not supposed to be here. So,
yeah, a title company is not just there to have you sit down and sign documents at closing.
Right.
They're there to take care of issues that might arise.
So, if you're going to look for an easement on a property, how do you go find out where are those located? Like, if I want to go find a copy of them, where can you find those at?
So in the title policy in Schedule B, they're going to list volume and pages for each one of those easements. Now, any title company worth their salt is going to be able to provide those documents to you. But you can also go down to your local courthouse or county clerk's office and get those documents yourself. They're also available online on certain websites. Texas File comes to mind, but you have to pay for those.
Right. But I mean, any good easement should really be recorded for the public to know, and that way you everybody in the world knows about it, and you don't have to run into problems later, right?
Exactly. Now, for an easement to be valid, it does not necessarily have to be recorded,
right?
But that kind of makes it difficult to know about if that easement isn't a public record. So.
Right. But I think if you want your neighbor to know, if it influences other people, I think it's always best practice to have it recorded.
Yeah.
So speaking of valid easements, kind of what are some things that makes an easement valid? And then we're going to go into kind of what makes an easement not valid. What do you typically see on a good easement? What would you think those are the criteria there?
On a good easement, let's say somebody wants a drainage easement on a property, or somebody wants an access easement over a property. The number one thing you're going to want to do is hire a surveyor to go out and tie into the boundary, write a meets and bounds description encompassing the location of that easement, and then provide an exhibit map. At that time, you can take the exhibit map and description, hire an attorney. The attorney will prepare that easement and then go record and file that easement, and then it's of record. And it's going to be a defined easement. You're going to know where it is. You're going to know what it covers and what it doesn't, and it's going to be all above board. It's not going to be written on a bar napkin, put in somebody's gun safe.
Right. And I think typically on written easements, they're going to be signed by all the parties involved, and usually there's 2, but there could be more. Yeah. You could have an access easement with 10 people. It depends on how many properties that easement goes through. But
that's right.
I mean, typically they're going to be signed by all parties. They're going to be in writing. They're going to reference deeds. They're going to reference a survey, hopefully. And I think ideally they're going to be recorded at the county. But I think additionally to that, depending on what kind of easement it is, that easement should outline the terms and agreements in there. So if you have an access easement, a lot of those will outline maintenance. It's going to outline who pays for what you can and can't do. Can you put a gate here? Can you not? But it's going to hold a lot of people harmless too. That just because you're crossing their property, if you were to damage your vehicle or damage your person or anything, they're not going to be held responsible for something that you did on your easement, right? So I think it kind of limits a lot of liability as well. But by and large, I think these easement agreements should kind of cover all the worst case scenarios, and that's kind of where an attorney comes in, because they're going to know what needs to be put on there, and I think what's enforceable and not enforceable. So
yeah, and you talked about maintenance and so forth. Shared well agreements come to mind.
Sure.
Who's going to pay for the maintenance on that well? What if the well runs dry? Where does the water line cross the property and then enter the other property if you're going to be sharing that well? So that's another type of easement.
And getting back to access easements, we're going to get to that in the next episode actually, but a lot of access easements, you can also make them a utility easement too. So just because a property has an access easement, that access easement could also be thrown in with utilities, to where if you need to bring water or power or whatever down that same easement, they kind of bundle them all together. So sometimes that's pretty useful just to save some paper. So if you own land, what are some times where you could need an easement? Let's say I bought a property and I need to get an easement. What are some easements that I usually would go get?
Well, some of the common ones are ones we've already spoken about. Power easements, water easements, access easements, and the like. And if you need an easement, you're going to need the owner of the land that the easement is crossing to sign off on that easement. Just because you want it doesn't mean you're going to get it.
Right.
So you'd have to go over and talk to that person or talk to the group of people that own the property and try and convince them that you need that easement.
Right.
And it's not as easy as it's easier said than done.
Right.
In some cases.
So there's a chance that, let's say I have a property and I need water. There's a chance my neighbor could not give me an easement. Would that be fair
Absolutely.
to say? Okay.
Oh yeah, that's happened.
Yeah. So if you need an easement and you can't get one, where do you go from there?
Well, I guess you could sell the property and try and find another property that better suits your needs, or find out that you don't have access to those certain utilities during a due diligence.
Yeah, and that would be good. Obviously, the first and foremost thing is you need to know the property that you're buying didn't have this easement, and if you needed it guaranteed, maybe you should either get it guaranteed before you close on it, or be able to live with the fact that maybe you can't get it. But I think some other things as far as getting easements that aren't there. On utilities, a lot of power and water stuff, they're usually a little bit easier because they are utilities and it's kind of for the greater good. I mean, I can understand why people wouldn't want like a gas pipeline. Like there's some stigmas on easements and pipelines and stuff like that. But a lot of times neighbors will give an easement for free. Sometimes they'll give you a free easement because let's say a water line's coming down the road and they have a really grown up fence line. And it's kind of a way for them to get their fence line cleared for free. And you get water. So it's kind of a win-win, and I've seen that work out a lot. Power's a little tougher because sometimes you cut down trees and people are partial to trees, which they should be. So sometimes I think you can get free easements. Other times I think you're going to have to go pay them. Maybe you say, hey, look, I really need an easement. I will bulldoze, the water company's going to bulldoze your fence line, then I'll build a fence back, right? So it may take some money to get people to help you on that.
And you can grant yourself an easement, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be free in the long run. I'm going to give you a story here and not name names or company names, but just give you some general thoughts. I was working on a deal, and it was a raw acreage piece of land, and they were going to plat it into multiple lots. When you plat, generally, that's the time the county is going to come and try and take some right-of-way for future right-of-way dedication. There was a water line that ran along the front of this property. At the time, that water line was within the property in a dedicated water line easement. When the property was going to be replatted, it was going to move that existing water line out of a dedicated easement and into the public right-of-way. When that happens, the water company didn't like that, and they said, we'll still provide you water. You have to pay to relocate our water line into the new property line, into a dedicated water line easement. Oh, and by the way, it's going to cost you $275,000. And if you don't pay that, we will not sign off on your plat. So you can grant yourself that easement. You own the land. You can say, yeah, I'll put an easement there, but it's not going to be free because you have to move that water line. And when you move that water line, it can really cause some problems.
Yeah, and I think a lot of those like water companies or any easement holders for that matter. Things get complicated when you have to move stuff, especially with the infrastructure in the ground. You run into a lot of issues there. But going back to needing an easement, there's some times where a neighbor won't give you one. And I've actually run into this personally, but eminent domain can come into play. And I know that's kind of a big and scary word, but public utilities for the greater good, which would be water, power, that sort of thing, they kind of do have the right of eminent domain sometimes. So that's a road nobody wants to go down. But eminent domain is another thing to where the water company can actually get an easement for you if somebody will give it to you. Of course, there's a lot of criteria you have to meet.
They can. It's usually for larger developments. They're going to be for the greater good of the community and so forth. And they take time, which not every buyer is going to give that time for that easement. Yeah,
no doubt.
You're right.
So ultimately, I think, though, it's always best practice to consult an attorney. I mean, we sit here and talk about it, and I think we've experienced a lot of it, but attorneys have a very good part to play here because things get really complicated really fast. So, what about any other kind of easement stories you got?
I worked on a recent survey where we had surveyed the property about 10 years ago, and it was going to be a subdivision for family members. The property was 60 some odd acres, and there were going to be 3 20-acre tracts,
Right.
roughly, out of it. And at the time, there was a driveway that snaked through the property to get to the other 2 tracts from the main road, because one of the tracts touched a main road, and then there was a middle tract and a back tract. To satisfy the bank, we created a 30-foot, which now probably wouldn't have been wide enough, but at the time, 30-foot access easement to legally get from the road back to the middle and back tracts. All was fine and good because at that time everybody in the family got along, right? So no one really used that. It was just an easement on paper. Everybody was using the existing road. The existing road probably went down 150 or 200 feet of that 30-foot access easement and then departed that easement. Well, in the 10 years since, the family members started to fight. They're having problems, and the owner, the family member in the middle, wants to sell his piece of land. And the family member closest to the road wanted to redefine the property line to more follow a fence line. And the family member in the middle doesn't want to do that, right? So the only real recourse that the family member at the front has is to cut off the family member in the back and say, you cannot use the road after it departs the access easement, and you have to build your own road to get back to that middle piece of property. And so that's happened. I've seen another easement story is it's another family partition type deal. A guy owned 150 acres, and he gifted 1 acre to his son smack dab in the middle of his property. The son was going to put a mobile home there. He put a mobile home in the middle of that 1 acre, and he defaulted on the loan a few years later. The mobile home company was going to take back that 1 acre and sell the 1 acre in the mobile home, and the father did not want a stranger living in the middle of his property. He put up a barbed wire fence. He put up signs saying, if you value your tires, you'll turn around now. Shoot first, ask questions later. And we had to get the constable to go out with us. We surveyed the easement on the ground that was existing, and eventually somebody bought that 1 acre. I wouldn't want to be the person that bought that acre because they were going to have to deal with an angry father, for the rest of their time.
Right.
Say, well, John, you've been doing this for a long time. What kind of stories about easements have you run into?
Yeah, so a couple of stories that I have. What I've seen a lot. I'll say one that I've seen a lot lately. I've seen a lot of longer easements, and let's say these easements are for access. And typically, a lot of easements are, in my opinion, the ones I've seen, a lot of them are straight. They usually follow a fence line or something, but lately I've seen some that are long and winding. They kind of follow an existing road that was there at one time, and they kind of did a meets and bounds description following that road to wherever it goes. But what I found lately is you see a lot of roads that drift over time. So these easements are kind of windy and they bend around stuff, and then a storm comes and a tree falls over. Well, instead of cutting down the tree, they just go outside the easement to get around the tree, or more likely it's a big mud hole. Let's say they need to bring in some rocks, so they just start going a little bit to the right to get around that mud hole. The mud hole gets bigger. They keep going a little to the right, and then they go to the left. And pretty soon, over time, you've got these easements that are in one spot, but the actual part that's physically used at a completely different spot. So that's kind of an interesting thing to watch over time. And then I've seen a couple of unrecorded easements, even on property that I've bought. I've had some folks that were using a part of a property, and when I pull title, it doesn't show up. So I'm thinking, okay, well they may not have the right to use this. But I actually had a property one time that had an unrecorded easement from like 1992, and oddly enough, everybody on that deed was dead. And the cool thing was, though, the title company said, hey, this wasn't in Schedule B, therefore we cover it. And the fact that all the people on this deed are now deceased, we can't, there's no way for anybody to prove if that's really a viable easement because those people aren't alive to tell you. So that's kind of one thing. That's why, recorded easements are so much better. You don't have to wonder about enforceability, even after you're deceased, if it's recorded, because you know it's recorded by those people. It was notarized. It was legitimate at the time that it was recorded. But it's really hard to go back and find like a 20 or 30-year-old document that you can't ask the people who signed it if that was really them. You could have forged a notary. They could have had multiple copies of it. Maybe the one that got recorded, there's a different version. There's a lot of things you can go down the road with that. So it was kind of interesting to be on and actually be in that position myself of thinking, hey, this is not here, and I know that they don't have the right. When it turns out they did, just kind of in a roundabout way. So another story I had was actually an easement that dealt with honeybees, and this is the one time where honeybees almost killed the deal for me. So there was an easement that's been there for a while, an existing road, but through some certain circumstances, we need to go get kind of a refreshed one. It needed to be updated with all the parties involved. So when we go to get it, there was language in that easement that there could be bees. We're talking about honeybees in like a box, right? They were trying to get honey from them. So that if there were honeybees on that easement, and those honeybees were to become Africanized and hurt or kill somebody on that easement, that the people who owned the property that the easement was on was not liable. And so it was it was kind of interesting to see this language in there. And I don't think there was any ill intent. I think it was just kind of one of those things of, hey, we raise bees and we kind of don't want to be responsible for them. But long story short, it was a time where honeybees really affected an easement. And luckily at the end of it, we were able to get that removed. It wasn't a big deal. But it was just kind of funny that the things you see in easements, like you wouldn't expect honeybees to be mentioned in there. So that was an interesting one. So
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, I think that kind of wraps up easements for us. Hopefully you found that interesting. I mean, there's a whole lot of intricate details of what easements could do for your property, and I think you need to be aware of all those. So we're always here to help. So reach out to any of us if you need any help on a property, and we'll catch you on the next episode.